You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I've spent most of my time in that space helping C-suites of varying companies, whether it's small businesses, medium and even large enterprises, help them make and implement decisions around technology. There is a lot of opportunity, particularly in the finance space. And the financial ecosystem, particularly in developing countries, with technology and advancements in technology and all of that, was ripe for explosion. We started that relationship with one or two subnationals in Nigeria and in Kenya as well, to see how we can leverage those partnerships. And the plan is to build on that and grow that in the coming years.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Gerrad Olisa-Ashar, who is co-founder of Diaspora Investment Partners Africa, which is a networking platform connecting private investors to entrepreneurs who are creating sustainable value and impact in Africa. Welcome to the podcast, Gerrad. How are you?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tessa. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. I know you've listened to the podcast before, so you already know I like to start from the beginning. So Please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Gerrad.
Fantastic. Again, thanks for the opportunity. Quite excited to be here, and well done to you on all the great work that you're doing through the podcast.
Thank you.
My roots are Nigerian. I'm originally from Nigeria. I am a family man living in Oxford. I consider myself to be a 24-year-old diasporan.
Brilliant. Me too.
So been in the UK since 99. So it'll be 24 years this year. From a career perspective, started off my career in technology. I've spent most of my time in that space, really helping C-suites of varying companies, whether it's small businesses, medium and even large enterprises in the UK. Help them make and implement decisions around technology with a more recent focus on cybersecurity. So that's my technical background. Today, however, I balance my time as a family man, a cybersecurity consultant, and also a finance entrepreneur. So that's brief background of who I am. Yeah.
Fantastic. So you mentioned your roots are from Nigeria, similar to myself. Family man, 24-year-old diasporan. I like that. Career in tech and cybersecurity, which has led you to the finance entrepreneurship work that you're doing at the moment, which ties into what we're going to talk about today, your work with Diaspora Investment Partners Africa. So what was the inspiration behind founding the company?
Yeah, it's been a journey. And as a diasporan yourself, you probably are aware some diasporans board that plane and leave their home countries for greener pastures, but they leave their heart behind, right? And take everything else with them abroad. And I'm one of those people. I've always had that link back or strong link back to my country, Nigeria, and indeed Africa. And I've always looked for a way to see how I could, with any way, means or form, have a reason not just to go back, but also to do some good there. I've maintained that passion about contributing to the economic development one way or the other. Another thing that's probably similar to a few diasporans is the shocking disparity between the developing countries or home countries where they're coming from and the developed countries. And, when you see things just working, you wonder to yourself, right, why isn't it just working back home? And how can I make things work back home? But it wasn't until more recently, actually, a quick story there, I started my very first company trying to invest or create businesses back home as early back in 2001, which is about 3 years, 2 to 3 years after I came. So it's always been there. It wasn't until 2017, as I completed my executive MBA at George Business School at the University of Cambridge, that it suddenly hit me that there is a lot of opportunity, particularly in the finance space. And the financial ecosystem, particularly in developing countries, was ripe with technology and advancements in technology and all of that was really, really ripe for explosion. And at the same time, you were seeing the Nigerian startups, African startups doing amazing things. And it was at that time that the journey really, really started. It took 2 years or so to kick things off. And during COVID, I tell a joke that when everyone didn't know what to do and got a bit bored during COVID, it was a ripe opportunity for my wife and I to really start the Diaspora Angel Network, which was the first phase of DEEPA. We've learned some lessons since then, and that's now evolved into DEEPA, the Diaspora Investment Partners for Africa. So that's where the inspiration has come from. That's the journey so far, and that's how we've got to where we are today.
Thank you for that. So you've detailed your journey and also mentioned as a diasporan, you always have that urge to connect back home. So with regards to connecting, how do you aim to connect private investors in the diaspora to entrepreneurs in Africa?
So, very good question. I think, first of all, it's important to make the point that from our experience and from what we've learned, the investment is a very long journey. It's not a destination in itself. There's a lot of work that needs to happen before capital is deployed and also long after capital is deployed in terms of monitoring and following through. So we are very honest about our role. We know it's an ecosystem. And the plan or the expectation is that it's not that the Diaspora Investment Partners Africa does every single thing. The role we play, and I, jokingly said to someone the other day, think of us as a business-focused social network. Our role really is to create those spaces where people who are interested, who may not necessarily be investors today, but are really keen and want to learn more, and the ones who are ready to invest today, connect those people to each other, first of all, and then link them to the entrepreneurs doing the great things. And we've got channels that we would use. We would use things like subnational governments. The Oyo state government in Nigeria came to the UK recently, and a number of our members were in attendance, where we spoke to government officials directly and some entrepreneurs that came in and flew in for that program. So we will continue to use those kind of spaces to connect the investors here in the diaspora and the entrepreneurs in Africa. We are also looking to do field trips where we could take some members to the local cities, like in Kenya, in Lagos, Nairobi, wherever we see the opportunities in terms of linking with our partners that we work with on the ground. So in summary, our role really is to do that connection between investors and themselves and also then the entrepreneurs. And that's the role we play. There will be subsequent partners that we work with when it comes to technically executing on deals. But that's not what we do right now. And we're very clear on that.
You mentioned the investment is a long journey and there are challenges that must be overcome pre and post investment. So from your experience, what challenges do Africans in the diaspora face when trying to invest back home?
How long is this podcast?
It's a whole episode in itself.
Exactly. I mean, there are lots of challenges, as you can imagine, but I'll touch on three, which I think are really key.
Brilliant.
The first one is what I call the lack of insight, right? As an investor, the first thing you need is insight. You need to be able to know not just what's happening at a macro level in any geographical location where you look to invest your money, but also on a micro level. How do industries play? What are the key risks in those industries? What are the opportunities in those industries? And typically in more advanced economies, what you have is a lot of data. And what you have as a result of a lot of data is that you have specific people with technical competencies, i.e. businesses who harness that data and then provide that to investors. So in the absence of data, you can't have that useful information. I know there are a number of companies that have tried to do this, who are African focused, and they do exist. And even where they exist, it's quite expensive because, it's a lot of work to put that insights together. So
Yes.
you find that investors have to pay for that. And for private investors who probably can afford it, but probably don't find the value in spending all that money just going out and getting this data. So that's one big one. So the investors in the diaspora lack insight of what's actually happening. And one of the ways we're trying to bridge that is to see as a organization together, we can help, one, try and look for that data, harness that data and present that back to our members. But that's long term. The second challenge is, which is closely linked, is the access to quality projects. I was reading a report the other day, and about $421 billion is the funding gap,
Wow.
according to the World Bank in Africa. Another report suggests that Nigeria, at some point, I think this was in 21, the funding gap was $158 billion in Nigeria alone.
Wow.
And this is just for the MSMEs, right? Now, with that, there are millions of SMEs on the continent in places like Nigeria that are doing stuff but don't have access to capital. The question then is, how do I, as an investor in the UK, how do I find out those men and women doing all of those things, in Nigeria and understand what they're doing and not just find them, but have access to them, to speak with them, to understand the pain points, to understand what point in their business journey they're in. How can I engage them? And I think that's a real challenge because if you don't have that level of engagement, it's difficult for you to part with your funding. And again, the context here is private investors, right? The more established institutional investors have their ways of doing all of this. So these are not necessarily the challenges they're facing, but these are the challenges that we found that our own members are facing at the moment and the challenges that we're trying to help them bridge ourselves as well. The third one, which I think is probably the biggest one, if not the biggest one, communicated in different ways, is the ability for investors to quantify and qualify risk. As an investor, the first thing that you're looking at is not necessarily your reward, because that is usually like wishes and aspirations, in a lot of cases, reality as well. But the place that one really needs to look at as an investor is what is the risk to me getting that reward. And for the astute investor, that's the first thing they're looking at, right? They're looking at the risk. Where is the risk to me making, whether it's 10%, 20%, 30%, right? Where is the risk to that? And is that risk properly mitigated? And unfortunately, a real challenge is to really get the information or the understanding or the capacity to do the appropriate due diligence that's required to understand that risk. And if you could get someone to work with you and help you achieve that, as an investor in the diaspora, it would make your decision making in terms of investing back home a lot much easier. So in my view, those are probably three of the key challenges that investors in the diaspora face.
I agree. So you've detailed the challenges that the investors in the diaspora face, lack of insight, access to quality projects, and quantifying and qualifying risk. And you've also detailed your role in helping them overcome some of these challenges. So how can people access your services?
Yeah, so for us, it's fairly straightforward. Our main channels is becoming a member. The first thing I would say is we've got a LinkedIn page and you can follow us on LinkedIn. You can learn more about what we do. I know some people are not necessarily keen to become members of or subscribe to certain memberships, and that's fair enough. But there are channels like LinkedIn where you can get more information. And we've got the website, which is deeper.africa. And from there, you can become a member, fill out this very short form. We get your details and we'll engage you from that. Now, there are two main levels of membership. There's the standard one, which costs you nothing, and you have access to pretty much everything. There's a premium membership for a fee, which will give you access to things like, when we have events like we had with the All Your State, for example, you'll be able to attend such events without necessarily paying for those events, and also any other events that we do or we host. So that's pretty much how you can get involved and engaged. We do appreciate communication, so we love to learn. So we would appreciate if people could even just give comments, even if it's through this podcast or commenting on the podcast or on our website. Get engaged, contact us, and together I think we can actually make this much better than it is at the moment.
I agree. Fantastic. So going back to the challenge of quantifying and qualifying risks, can you give us a bit more detail in terms of how do you ensure that people's investments are secure?
Right. If I go back to the point of the role we play, and the role we play right now is a social network. Our real focus right now is to connect two together. We work with third parties who have more expertise in doing the due diligence and advisory services. So we work with some sister companies that are very good at doing that. So Deeper in itself, it's not an organization that would secure your investment, but working with our partners, what we would do, and I think if you work with any investment company or investment advisory company in the world, ultimately the investor needs to take their own risk. What we will be very good, or our partners we work with, they're very good at, and what they have a lot of expertise on is properly assessing the risk and communicating that in a language that you as an investor in, say, the Europe or US or UK would understand and you're familiar with, not just understand, but you're familiar with. So you use the same terminology, the same language that you would use when assessing an investment here, say in the UK or in the US or anywhere else. So they go through that journey with you, provide that advisory services with you. Ultimately, you make the decision, and they actually do follow through to make sure that the entrepreneurs, the due diligence that's required to make sure that the entrepreneurs are doing what they say they would do, because that's a big part of it, right? And quite frankly, no matter how much you want to, you are limited from a place of proximity. You are limited to perform that role effectively from, say, the UK or US. So that's why we depend on partners on the ground who have that local knowledge and have that local access to these entrepreneurs to ensure that, those entrepreneurs are doing what they had promised to do prior to the investment coming in.
Thank you for that clarification. So if we look at the third-party companies and partners that you work with, are there any challenges that are unique to Africa that they face when trying to invest the money raised into African companies, entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think the number one challenge that we are seeing is the assumption that the entrepreneurs themselves, their assumption is that they need money. Whereas in reality, what they probably do is business process optimization, not necessarily money, or money and business process optimization. They may just need to go digital to reduce their operating costs. But they look at it, I need more money to get more workers. And you're thinking, well, if you spend that money doing this instead or automating the process, you don't need to employ more people. You just need to put that money in technology and it will help you and enable you scale. So what we are seeing more and more is that what the founders or the entrepreneurs believe they need, in some cases are not what they need. So that's a real challenge. Imagine an entrepreneur telling you, I need access to a loan so that I can go and employ 10 more people. And your job is to tell that person, well, you don't need that money to employ 10 more people. You need half that money to go and, invest in the technology. They don't accept it because they feel they know the business more than you. So what we are doing to try and address those challenges is that before we even invest, there needs to be some sort of relationship with these entrepreneurs. There needs to be some sort of journey that they're going on. we kind of work with them to assess what they really need. And in some cases, it may not necessarily mean investment, or it may not mean as much investment as we would want to give in, but it's more of advisory services. So for me, that's one of the key challenges unique to Africa, as it were. Is that unique to Africa? I think some people will argue differently, but
Yes.
it's something that we're seeing a lot on the ground.
Fantastic. So I guess if we stick to the theme of challenges and things have been affecting not just Africa, but businesses globally, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the current economic downturn, has this impacted the work that you're doing in terms of venture capital, private equity industries within Africa?
It has a whole lot. And it's quite shocking how things have changed in a very short space of time. It also goes to show you how volatile things could be. I remember in 2020, early 2021, or for most of 21, there was what you call the boom in the market, particularly for venture capital, with the exit of Paystack and the exit of one or two other companies on the African continent. A lot of money started coming in. And that was good. And I think that was, no matter how you look at it, I think it was a good thing. More entrepreneurs got access to capital, which generally is a good thing. Unfortunately, the downside to that is that with a lot of money coming in, valuations go up. For want of a better word, people didn't necessarily, at least in our experience, didn't necessarily spend too much time doing due diligence. So we had scenarios where if we didn't invest quickly as part of Dan, if we didn't invest quickly, we lose the deal, right? So there was always that FOMO, fear of missing out for deals. And people invest in things that probably were not necessarily worth the value that was being placed in them. With the global downturn, cash is a bit more restricted. People are thinking a lot more now. And quite frankly, that was a key factor in our decision to broaden our scope from just angel investing into actually investing in SMEs, because people were now aware of the inherent risk with startups. Investors who were looking to go back to Africa to invest suddenly realized, well, if I wanted to start investing back home, maybe I start with the safer instruments. Now, those safer instruments may not necessarily give you the same rewards. So again, it's down to the ultimate objective of the investor that would, then determine who they invest in or what they invest in. The delayed effect of COVID, which I think is still happening globally, is beginning to have a pinch on the amount of money that's coming in. And from an investor side of things, we are thinking a lot more about investing. And from a deeper, how does that impact deeper in the work we're doing? It means we need to be a lot more crisp in our communication. We need to be a lot more clearer in communicating or articulating the risks. We need to do proper due diligence. We need to work with partners who really understand the local dynamics and things like in Nigeria, for example, the recent change of government. What impact does that have on your investment or your decision to invest, right? We need to be able to articulate those things in a much better way to give the investors a lot more reassurance before they invest.
Thank you for that. If we move away from challenges and look at opportunities, how does Deeper identify and select the opportunities and projects that it supports?
Great question. And I think this is where we feel with Deeper, we probably, would I argue it's an edge? I'll say unique, right? You could argue differently whether it's an edge or not, but it's definitely unique in the fact that what we like to go after, or the kind of opportunities we like to go after, are what we refer to as market creating opportunities. These are opportunities where you see entrepreneurs that are looking to address a market that doesn't exist today, right? And it doesn't exist not because you don't have the consumers in the space. It's just that they are not consuming right now. In other words, they're in a non-consumption bucket. I'll give you an example. Before the telcos started operating, people wanted to use phones. They just didn't have access to it. using Africa. And I think that that's broadly going across Africa now. But in the last 10 years or so or longer, you're seeing a lot of telcos that have spun up across Africa. What's happening there now is that a lot of people are now using mobile phones to do a lot of things, transactions, etc. Now, that's a market creating innovation, as it were, which has then created an ecosystem. So for DEPA, for example, if assuming we were there 10 years ago, what we would be looking at in that ecosystem is, right, the telcos are here. We may not necessarily be able to invest in the telco itself, but that telco is creating a market, right? So what you're having is mobile phone resellers or mobile phone sellers. You're having businesses, small businesses that are now buying recharge cards and reselling recharge cards. You've got mobile phone accessories. You've got small businesses doing very well selling mobile phone accessories, right? You look into that ecosystem and you identify opportunities within that ecosystem, knowing that the underpinning innovation, i.e., telecommunications, i.e., mobile phones, is a very strong one and a compelling one. So we tend to look for those opportunities. And if I were to give an example of a space that we're really excited about and we're looking in right now, it's the insurance space.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of non-consumption when it comes to insurance in Africa, particularly in the places where you have a lot more people, places like Nigeria, Kenya, etc. Now, there is a huge opportunity there for insurance players to begin to use things like technology to create products that are tailored to the non-consumers of insurance who actually need it. It might be similar, and I refer to Nigeria a lot because obviously I'm Nigerian and I know a lot more about, but I think there's similarities across. But in Nigeria today, it's a very common thing that you go to the hospital, you will not be treated unless you deposit a certain amount of money, right?
Yes.
Now, I know that there are people looking at that problem today and there are people building solutions for that problem. Now, that's an opportunity in my book. How do I help this young woman, middle-aged woman, or elderly man who doesn't necessarily have the cash today, but how can I create an environment or a solution for him to be able to walk into the hospital anytime he or she's not feeling well with the confidence that, you know what, the bill's taken care of? And if we find people in that space that are able to create those solutions, those are the kinds of people that we would be investing in. Those will be the kind of opportunities that we'll be looking out for. And that's just one example. There's so many more examples or opportunities, as you probably are aware. But yeah, market creating opportunities are the ones that we would be looking out for and we'll be trying to get into early and be recommending to our investors.
Fantastic. So you've mentioned there that you target businesses or entrepreneurs that create opportunities or markets that don't currently exist. You mentioned insurance. So outside of insurance, what other industries or sectors do you believe have shown, say, significant potential for investment and growth in Africa?
In the financial sector, there's a huge opportunity. I mean, something closely dear to my heart because we have an organization that does that in Nigeria at the moment that operates in that space. The opportunities to serve the MSMEs, the opportunity to serve those companies that are doing very well, but are stuck in a particular stage of their growth.
Yes.
And that's just because they don't have not just the capital, but they don't have the expertise to expand. So there are opportunities, and I know one or two organizations that are thinking of tackling that problem, but there will be many more because the market is so huge. There will be many more. I mean, I stand to be corrected, but the last time I researched this, we had about 56 million BVNs in Nigeria, right? For a company of over 200 million people. A BVN basically means that you are in the banking sector because you've got a specific number that says, yeah, this guy is in the financial ecosystem. You've only got 56 million of a country of over 200 and something million. How do the other 150 million or so people engage financially if they don't have a BVN? That's a big question. So in a lot of sense, there's a huge chunk of people that are not involved in the financial ecosystem. Now, how can you bring those people in? I want to meet an entrepreneur that's doing that. I want to meet an entrepreneur that's actually working on that, because that's the kind of entrepreneur that I would want to invest in or be recommending to our members to invest in. How is that entrepreneur solving that problem? What ecosystem is he generating, right? He or she generating, because he or she may not be doing it on their own. They may need people to support their business model and those other people support other people. So, you understand, how does that ecosystem operate? Because in that ecosystem, there will be one, two, three, four, probably even hundreds of businesses that you can, provide capital to or invest in. And that for me is the exciting piece when you're looking at the non-consumption, because you're almost looking at what you might call virgin wells in the oil industry that you can go and tap and drill and, and create value for the investors that are able to get in.
I totally agree. I believe that companies in the missing middle present a huge opportunity for investment, long-term growth, job creation, and economic development. So with this in mind, how do you believe that your work contributes to development and creating long-term impact in Africa?
Yeah, I think, without necessarily trying to sound too important, I'm looking for the right word, but maybe I'll use that one for now. I'm very big on ecosystems. I'm very big on collaboration and partnership. And what we're trying to do at Deeper is not something that we've invented. We are not the first people to see this problem. I mean, that's why countries have embassies, right?
Yes.
One of the main priorities for the Nigerian embassy is to get investment into Nigeria, build those relations to get economic development between the UK and Nigeria relationship. Now, so we see ourselves as partnering with these other organizations to try and deliver that economic development. And we jokingly say, I think, again, the last report I read, and I believe this was for 2022, if I'm correct, about $20 billion went from the diaspora into Nigeria alone. $20 billion.
Yes.
Now, if we could take 0.5% of that and channel that into economic development, not to say the 20 billion didn't go to economic development, but most of that, I would guarantee you, went into informal economic development that's not sustainable. And that's why, for us, sustainability and impact is very important. We're not just sending money back home to, say, go to the groceries, even though in effect that's helping the small business that's selling the grocery. What we're thinking is, if we can take some of that money, deliberately channel it to where it will create the most value, and we do that successfully, then I think taking 1 billion, which is our dream, is that, one day we can comfortably say we've channeled $1 billion in 1 year into the African continent from the diaspora. That for us would be quite a significant milestone that we're confident we could do. Right. It will take time, but we're confident that that's achievable. And for us, that's what success would look like.
Thank you for that, Gerrard. The work that you do obviously requires a deep network, partnerships, and collaborations. Are there any unique, say, strategies or initiatives that you use to foster these collaborations and knowledge sharing among investors and entrepreneurs?
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's really about who you know.
Yes.
And, whether we like it or we don't, that's at the heart, and you can't ignore that. So what we're trying to do, fortunately, we've been blessed with a strong network. We've got quite strong social capital in Nigeria and Kenya, and we intend to leverage that. We're also open up to partnerships. So I'm sure you're aware of Invest Africa.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're in very early conversations with Invest Africa to see how we can partner with them to do other things and maybe create events in partnership with them. Again, very, very early conversation, so nothing's concrete there just yet. But that's our hope. We also intend to work closely with the embassies. We're in early conversations with the Nigerian embassy and the Kenyan embassy to see how we could partner with them and create these spaces where investors can come in. The British Chamber of Commerce is another one. We haven't started conversations yet, but we'll be looking to start conversations with the British Chamber of Commerce as well. And then that's on the diaspora side, i.e. here. Then on the flip side, locally at home, it's working closely with the subnationals are very powerful in all of this. And I think it might be an area that hasn't been looked at because a lot of the funding that goes back, it goes for large infrastructure projects. And even when they come to look for funding, they're looking for funding for those things, which is great, right? And that's needed. But I think with the subnationals, you've got about 30-something states I think 36 states in Nigeria,
Yes.
if I'm correct. I hope they haven't created one in the last 2 weeks. But yeah, we've got about 36 states. Those are 36 subnationals, right? Imagine working with all 36 of them to identify small business, because these guys are closer to the entrepreneurs, they're closer to the ecosystems, they're usually monitoring those ecosystems either through regulation or law or something. So it makes very good sense to work with them. And we've started that relationship with one or two subnationals in Nigeria and in Kenya as well to see how we can leverage those partnerships. And the plan is to build on that and grow that in the coming years. But we're quite deliberate. If there's anything we've learned from the Diaspora Angel Network since we created that was not to move too quickly. Slow and steady, like they say, is going to win this race. It's not a race that you win by rushing into things. So we're also very deliberate about the pace that we're making. So that's at the back of our mind all the time.
Fantastic. So you mentioned something quite key. It's about who you know and what you know. So if we focus on understanding or knowing local context, how do you go about navigating some of the unique cultural and regulatory landscapes across different African markets when doing the work that you're doing?
I think that's a great question and probably a very, very important one as well. Particularly navigating the local regulatory space, it's a difficult one. I found myself reading the Microfinance Bank Prudential Guidelines the other day. And the reason I'm reading that is just trying to understand if I was going to invest in this space or I'm going to ask the members of DEPA to invest in this space, what are the kind of regulations? Are those regulations being adhered to as part of the operating model of the company that I'm looking to invest in? So there's an element of where investors really have to do the work themselves to understand these. What we will do as DEPA and what we're intentional about at DEPA is to make that journey easier one for you. In direct answer to the question, how do you navigate those challenges? I think it's really including that into your risk calculations. Anyone operating locally in the country has to have really good sense of risk management. Again, you talked about some of the challenges we see earlier on in these entrepreneurs. Governance and risk management is very low in those organizations. And in some cases, you can understand why. Because these are small businesses, and really what they want to do is to grow their business. And they don't have the resources to create all this governance and control, the kind of things that investors would really like to see before they invest their money. What we try and do is to explain to the investors, on one hand, the reality on ground is that they can't afford to have that right now. They may be aware of it, they may be conscious of it, but the reality is that they just don't have enough money to do that. And that's where some of the advisory services that we like to give to these entrepreneurs come in. On the other hand, you have to speak to the entrepreneurs and you have to make it clear to the entrepreneurs that you can't go around, seeking investment if you don't have your house in order. Good risk management, good governance and controls is one way of demonstrating that you have your house in order. And you don't have to get the most fancy systems, Excel is your best friend, like they say, right? Excel is your best friend. just put some things down on Excel, monitor, review that on a regular basis in terms of a practical example. And then on the underside, and this is another advantage of us working with the subnationals, it's to really understand the priorities of these subnationals, understand their priorities from a regulatory standpoint, understand their priorities from an economic development standpoint. Is that an area that they want to focus on? Is that an area that they're keen to see investment in? And when you understand that, that to an extent kind of mitigates that risk. And I keep going back to the Your State Summit. It's just that it only happened 2 weeks ago, and it's, probably still very fresh in my mind. But they came to the UK with 5 sectors that they are looking to promote. Now, immediately, I'm thinking to myself, well, if I'm going into Your State, for example, those are the 5 sectors I want to be promoting to my members, because I know that they would have government backing in those sectors because the government is focused. The subnational government is focused on those sectors. So that's another way of trying to mitigate those risks. It doesn't eliminate the risk at all, but in summary, it's, educate investors here in the UK about the realities on ground, educate the entrepreneurs on ground, make them aware that risk management and control governance is important, and also working closely with the people that set these regulations, whether that's a subnational or whether that's at a federal level. Work closely with them, be very much aware about their objectives and their priorities, and try and feed that into your decision making as you invest.
You've detailed the importance of understanding the regulatory objectives and trends within Africa and Nigeria. So, sticking to the theme of trends, what positive trends in, say, the African diaspora investing space are you seeing that you're currently excited about?
I think the one trend I'm seeing is more money going into Africa.
Yes.
I'm really excited about that. And for someone that has wished this for a long time, there was a famous former minister, Dr. Obi Ezekwesili,
Yes.
if I've got her name correctly. I think one of her mantras now is that Africa is a business case. And it is good to see that, it's taking time for that transition to happen from Africa being somewhere where, oh, right, it's an aid case. Let's give them some aid. Let's help them do stuff, to transitioning to becoming a business case, i.e., I need to be in Africa if I want to get the kind of returns that I need, right? Irrespective of the risks, right? I can still make the returns that I want or I desire. And I think more and more people in the diaspora are seeing that. I think more and more people are keen. Funnily enough, and I must put this into context, a lot of the money that goes in to Africa today, from an investment perspective, is not necessarily going in through the diaspora, right? It's usually the big institutions, the big VCs are the ones putting that money in. But on a private investor level, I am seeing more private investors. We did a proof of concept fund on the DAN in 2021. We closed that round. We raised about $500,000. And this is just from a small group of private investors. The amount of money we've channeled through DAN into Africa is over $1 million in about 18 months that we started. That's not the first time we've tried to do that, but I would not have been able to do that, 5 years ago. So I think that trend is changing now. I think people are becoming more open. And with technology, and let's not forget this, with technology, we are able to get more information, more data. We're not getting near enough as we should, but it's much better than it was 5 years ago. And I think if that trend continues in another 5-10 years, what we will be seeing is that it's much, much easier to convince or to persuade someone to invest in Africa.
Fantastic. So if we continue to look ahead and look closer to home, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And Diaspora Investment Partners Africa, what would that look like? What will you be doing?
I see us doing exactly what we're doing now, probably just with more people. I think the opportunity for the Diaspora Investment Partners is huge. The name Diaspora is deliberate. You have the Nigerian diaspora, you have the Kenyan diaspora, you have the Brazilian diaspora, you
Yes.
have, the Indian diaspora, right? So it's really all about replicating this notion that I've left home for greener pastures. I have, one way or the other, tasted some of these greener pastures. I have some assets with me now, and I can put some of those assets, channel some of those assets, whether it is in form of, financial capital or in form of skills capital. I can channel some of this back to the continent or to my home to help develop my home. And I think that's a sentiment that's shared irrespective of what home country you've come from or home continent, is shared with many people across the world. So for us, it could go as far as you want it to go. But if we're bringing it down to what our vision and our focus or our mission is, the $1 billion figure. And for now, we would keep chasing that $1 billion figure, whether we chase it with just the Nigerian diaspora, the Kenyan diaspora, or we have to get, the Indian diaspora involved. We'll see. But we're taking it one step at a time. And who knows, they could be things like having the diaspora bonds. I know one or two countries have tried. We could help facilitate that, right? Someday, working with national governments to help them facilitate those diaspora bonds, which make them accessible for people in the diaspora to invest in directly. Who knows? There's quite a bit opportunities ahead that we're excited about.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, African proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Oh, there's quite a few that I like, but if there's one quote, there is nothing a man can achieve if he does not care who takes the credit. But that's the quote for me that keeps me going. Because what that tells me is that, as long as you're seeing the results, as long as you're seeing, we get mixed up sometime about doing this for ego, being responsible for doing something good or something great. And I think that's a good aspiration for any human being. But also at the same time, it could be very limiting.
Yes.
If you're not conscious about it. Yeah.
So as we're coming to the end of today's conversation, I was wondering if you had any closing remarks or final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing.
Yes, I think for me, I'll start off with this. Africa is a business case. It is a very compelling business case, but it is only that if you understand the risks as associated with the opportunities that are there. The opportunities are real. The opportunities are exciting, and the opportunities are rewarding on multiple levels. At Deeper, what we're trying to do is to harness those opportunities as a network of people who are keen to see sustainable impact and growth in Africa. And if you would like to learn more or know more, please visit the website. It's called www.deeper.africa. That's DIPA.Africa. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great way to close today's conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights, experience, and the great work that you're doing at Diaspora Investment Partners Africa. The dedication to connecting private investors with African entrepreneurs to create sustainable development and impact is truly commendable. So thank you for joining us on the podcast today, Gerrard.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, like I said, as I started off with, I'll end with that. Well done for the great work you're doing.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, and we will speak soon.
Good. Speak soon.
Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.